Portrait of Gandhi has been created by Rashmi Gupta, president of the MGPC, and we have the garland also made by her. And we have two panelists, who one of them has joined us, and Dr. Carson is on his way. So this is a celebration of Gandhi's birthday, which is October 2, and this is followed by this lecture on the second day. That hymn was composed by the 15th century poet Narsi Mehta. And in essence, it says that the true God's person is one who who recognizes the pain of others and tries to ameliorate without taking pride in it. Thank you for listening to this. I'd like to now invite the President of Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council, Mrs. Rashmi Gupta, to welcome you.
Thank you very much, Jagmohan ji. As usual, it was very beautifully presented. Yeah, the garlanding, our virtual garlanding. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council, I welcome you to this online panel discussion, Mahatma Gandhi Beyond the Civil Rights Movements. I'm delighted and honored to welcome our distinguished guests, His Excellency, the High Commissioner of India, Mr. Ajai Bisaria, and the President of Carleton University, Dr. Benoit-Antoine. A very warm welcome to our special guest speakers, Dr. Clayborne Carson, Professor of American History at Standford University, and Dr. Faisal Devji, Professor of Indian History at the University of Oxford, England. I must thank this wonderful technology, which enables us to meet here online during these challenging times of COVID. I'll give you a very brief background of the Peace Council before we start our panel discussion. Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council was founded in the year 2006 at the initiative of a group of citizens of Ottawa. The MGPCO is a non-profit charitable organization. The main objectives of the Peace Council include promoting Gandhian thoughts and principles, educating the Ottawa and surrounding communities in principles and practices of non-violence, harmony, and peace, and create multicultural leaders and to foster leaders that emulate Gandhi's style of leadership through our new generation leaders on. The Peace Council has partnered with the Carleton University to assist in fulfilling its objectives. It has endowed the annual MK Gandhi Lecture in the College of the Humanities at the Carleton University. The record of MGPC's activities over the years does exist on our website, gandhiji.ca. Now, without taking much time, I request His Excellency, the High Commissioner of India, Mr. Ajai Bisaria, to give his opening remarks. Mr. Ajai Bisaria.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Rashmi ji. Dr. Rashmi Gupta, President of the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council of Ottawa, Dr. Jagmohan Humar, President of Carleton University, Dr. Bacon, Dr. Clayborne Carson, Professor of American History at Standford, and Director of the Martin Luther King Research and Education Institute, and Dr. Faisal Devji, Professor of Indian History at the University of Oxford, England, and author of a book on Gandhi as well. And all our dear participants, it's wonderful to have all of you together in this grand finale of the 150th anniversary celebration of Mahatma Gandhi. And it is also, I think, particularly gratifying that we are ending on a high note with this particular session with two such distinguished professors in our midst today. But I want to thank the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council for all that you have done, all that you have been doing for promoting Gandhiji's legacy. I want to thank Carleton University for being part of this process, for hosting Gandhiji, for hosting the statue as well of Gandhiji. And of course, we are all keen to hear the distinguished scholars speak today and interpret one of the legacies of Gandhiji, which is the Mahatma Gandhi beyond this, the civil rights movement. I don't want to make a presentation adding to what our distinguished scholars will speak, but I thought I would make just 2 or 3 brief comments on Gandhiji's legacy. First, I think the philosophy of nonviolence was more than a philosophy. Gandhiji's genius lay in his ability to see the interconnectedness and the unity between all things. So between philosophy, politics, action, the unifying thought of this ideology which could translate into action. Gandhiji's major political achievement included leading the movement that ended colonial rule in India. And this he did using the political instruments of civil disobedience, satyagraha, non-violence. But his vision went way beyond the politics to encompass a very holistic view of life, of sustainable development, of human rights. And that is the legacy we continue to promote till today. He promoted nonviolence not just as a philosophy and a political strategy, but also as a means of achieving justice and change. Indeed, many of his ideas have foreshadowed the movements we now see for fighting for climate change and sustainable development, for instance. The second point I wanted to make is the way the legacy has endured in the 21st century. As we celebrate 150 years of the birth of Gandhiji, the legacy that he left behind in the 20th century has continued in the 21st century. In the country of his birth, we continue to see movements, a very robust debate, very steady scholarship, re-examining the legacy in multiple ways of Gandhiji. And you would also have seen the inspiration it has provided to several political movements in India. For instance, the Swachh Bharat mission of providing cleanliness and a toilet to every home in India was truly inspired by Gandhiji's vision very explicitly. And so is the drinking water mission that is of providing by 2022 drinking water, tapped drinking water to every household. So he continues to inspire the political leadership in multiple ways in India, apart from being very conscious in the debate. The third point I would make is that the legacy endures globally as well. And this is evidence of the fact that the fact that we're having this conversation in Canada has something to do with it. We are, of course, having a global conversation, but Gandhiji's legacy continues to inspire several global movements. So it was certainly an enduring political idea, an enduring moral idea. Just to give you some, or to recall some instances, South African President de Klerk was greatly influenced by Gandhiji's principles. So was the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu. And from Martin Luther King to Nelson Mandela, many world leaders have very consciously adopted Gandhiji's legacy and stated that they were inspired with it in many different ways, many of them adapting the legacy to their own particular needs in the context they operated in. In the United States, which we will discuss today, Dr. Martin Luther King was very much inspired by Gandhiji. Gandhi, King liked the Thoreau's idea that men should not obey evil or unjust laws. And he found that Gandhiji had won freedom for his country from British rule, acting on that very principle. And there's a great resonance of the historic Salt March at Dandi with the courageous Montgomery bus boycott against racial segregation in the United States. And Dr. King's famous statement, which is often quoted, if humanity is to progress, Gandhi is inescapable. He lived, thought, acted, and inspired by the vision of humanity evolving towards a world of peace and harmony. More recently, Barack Obama, the former US president, said he saw Mahatma Gandhi as an inspiration, as a portrait of the apostle outside his office. He said, in my life, I have always looked to Mahatma Gandhiji as an inspiration because he embodies the kind of transformational change that can be made when ordinary people come together to do extraordinary things. And we know that Gandhiji has inspired a lot of common folk across the world, whether it was Joan Baez, the American folk singer and human rights activist, or Cesar Chavez, the social activist, or Joanna Macy, the environmental activist, or Mubarak Awad, the non-violent Palestinian leader. It was Thich Nhat Hanh, the Vietnamese Buddhist leader, who took great inspiration from Gandhiji's actions, and he stressed on the fact that the means rather than the end was important when Nath said, I think we may fail in our attempts to do things, yet we may succeed in correct action when the action is authentically nonviolent, based on understanding, based on love. I think these were thoughts that have truly inspired multiple global leaders. And I'd like to end on a personal note of my diplomatic career and talking of Gandhi's legacy in multiple geographies. For instance, I was ambassador in Lithuania, where we had occasion to dedicate a statue to Gandhi and his friend Herman Kallenbach, the Lithuanian Jew who was helpful to him or was his very close friend in Tolstoy farm and helped him evolve many of his political ideas in South Africa. And again, the legacy in Lithuania when the Soviet Union was disintegrating and the Lithuanian movement was starting, the movement led by Landsbergis, who later became president of Lithuania, was inspired by Gandhi. He talked of the civil and non-violent non-cooperation against the Soviet regime. Similarly, in Poland, I had the opportunity to meet with Lech Wałęsa, who started the Solidarity movement, and he told me how inspired he was by Gandhi, and he wrote about this as well. And again, that was a movement that challenged communism and brought about its hasty end. I was last in Pakistan, where, as you would know, Gandhiji has a mixed reception. It's a troubled legacy. The deep state of Pakistan does not want to acknowledge the role of Gandhi in the freedom struggle because it seems that he was anti-partition and therefore was he anti-Pakistan. It glosses over the fact that Gandhi fought very hard for a fair and equitable partition once the partition had become inevitable. So a couple of years ago when I was in Islamabad celebrating an occasion on the 2nd of October, I decided to look for people influenced by Gandhi in Pakistan. And I called in a number of them. They were hesitating because of the deep states frowning on the Gandhi legacy, but many came. And among them was Afrasiab Khatak, who belongs to the Awami National Party, which was a sort of inheritor of the legacy of Badshah Khan, who was known as the Frontier Gandhi and was a very close friend of Gandhi. And this party now continues to talk about Pashtun rights and multiple other rights, often quoting Gandhi. So even in a country where the official narrative bans the mention of Gandhiji or frowns upon his legacy, the legacy in a subterranean, subaltern sense persists. So I just wanted to share with you these very quick thoughts before we get into hearing our distinguished professors. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. It was great to that you share your such inspiring, experiences of your life, which is really wonderful. I request now Dr. Becon, the president of the Carleton University, to give his remarks before we really start today on our panel.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. Your Excellency, it's really wonderful to see you again. Many thanks for your enlightening remarks and for your ongoing support of Carleton University. It's much appreciated. Mrs. Gupta, Professor Humar, thank you for your leadership and for bringing us together today. At Carleton, we're very, very pleased to partner with the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council. And as you know, and as we saw, a symbol of this important partnership is the life-size statue of Gandhi that was installed in front of Richcraft Hall on our beautiful campus in 2011. Many of you will also be familiar with the Canada-India Centre for Excellence, established at Carleton in 2010 in collaboration with the Indo-Canadian community and the High Commissioner of India at the time. The center, as many of you will know, promotes policy-relevant research, capacity building, entrepreneurship development, community engagement, and many activities that enhances the Canada-India bilateral partnership. And the program, truly wonderful, was publicly acknowledged by Minister Baines during a recent visit to India by the Prime Minister. The center's professional development program provides short, focused training opportunities for Indian students and young professionals, and only in the summer of 2019, we welcomed over 150 students from across India to our beautiful campus and provided training on subjects including topics, including data analytics, security, and business strategy. The center has built very strong academic partnerships with leading Indian institutions as well. The Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Management are a good example. So at Carleton, let me say very strongly that we're extremely proud of our privileged relationship with the Indo-Canadian community and with the great country of India. And today is one of our favorite events of the year. In 2012, the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council endowed an annual Gandhi Lecture on Peace and Humanity at our prestigious College of the Humanities, and since then the lecture has been held every year in early October, around October the 2nd. Leading scholars from all around the world, as you well know, have delivered the Gandhi Lecture. This year's lecture is being presented in the form of a panel discussion with two very distinguished panelists, Dr. Carson, Dr. Devji. Let me welcome you. It's a great pleasure to have you with us today. I look forward to hearing your remarks and the panel. Many thanks, everyone, for inviting me, and many thanks for joining us virtually.
Thank you very much, Dr. Becon. Your very presence makes a lot of difference for all of us. Thanks again very much. Now, let's get on the panel side. Now, I'm going to invite Mr. Rahil Khan. He's our Vice President of the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council. He's our MC for today. And I must say that the major credit goes to Rahil for organizing this event. So Rahil, you are in the best position to introduce our speakers of today. And now it's all yours, in your hand.
Thank you, Rashmi ji. Adab, namaskar, sat sri akal. Bienvenue à nos panélistes, participants et à nos invités. My name is Rahil Khan. I'm the Vice President of the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council of Ottawa. I'm going to help moderate our panel discussion today with the help of another distinguished board member, Dr. Anne Vallely. I'll provide some instructions for how participants can address their questions during the more open Q&A period. But what we're going to do is have some opening remarks from Professor Devji and Professor Carson, followed by a bit of canned questions from me and Anne. But before we go into that, I actually want to give a bit of a short introduction to our very distinguished, regarding our distinguished guests. One of them is actually calling in from California. So it's around maybe 10:30 a.m. there. And the other one is actually dialing in from England, which is around 6:30 p.m. there. So I think Professor Carson in California is finishing his breakfast in California, and Professor Devji is finishing his dinner in England. So I'll go into a description of our first panelist, Dr. Clayborne and Carson, and I'll try and summarize his long list of accomplishments. He's a professor of history at Standford University and is eminently suited to discuss the intersection between Mahatma Gandhi and different civil rights leaders with practical lessons for today's human rights struggle. He has devoted most of his professional life to the study of Dr. Martin Luther King and the movements that Dr. King inspired. In addition to being the Martin Luther King Centennial Professor of History at Stanford, he is also the Ronnie Lott Family Director of the Martin Luther King Jr. Research and Education Institute. This institute had its origins in 1985 under the auspices of Coretta Scott King as a long-term project to edit and publish Dr. King's writings and speeches. During his undergraduate years at UCLA, Dr. Carson also took part in civil rights and anti-war protests. And many of his writings reflect these experiences by stressing the importance of grassroots organizing and nonviolent resistance to injustice within the African-American freedom struggle. He's authored a number of books related to these topic areas. And last year, the Institute organized a very unique conference called the Gandhi King Global Initiative. So welcome, Dr. Carson, who I believe has joined us and now has audio access. I'm also going to introduce our second very distinguished panelist, Dr. Faisal Devji, who is a very versatile professor of Indian history at the University of Oxford in England, and also eminently qualified to discuss the transformative potential of Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of nonviolence as applied to today's struggles. He is a professor of history at St. Anthony's College and Oxford University, and has held faculty positions at the New School in New York, Yale University, and the University of Chicago, where he also received his PhD. He's a fellow at New York University's Institute of Public Knowledge and Yves Ottoman Chair at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. His research areas focus on Indian political thought, as well as that of modern Islam. Dr. Devji's broader concerns have to do with ethics and violence in the globalized world. Some of his most recent books include The Impossible Indian, Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence, which offers a fresh view about Gandhiji as a hard-hitting political thinker willing to counter the greatest violence in pursuit of a global vision that went beyond a nationalist agenda. So, and to just finalize, although he has Indo-African roots, Dr. Devji is a Canadian citizen who did undergraduate here, and we're hoping to someday repatriate him back to Canada as a brain gain for us. So I'm going to now open up the floor for opening remarks, first from Dr. Carson. So Dr. Carson, I welcome you to provide your opening presentation remarks.
Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to have such a distinguished audience. And I think this is, if I count right, this is my 6th Zoom meeting to celebrate the 150th. From California, I celebrated with the people in India who were already into the Gandhi holiday, even though it was my evening, Thursday evening. And now we are here on Saturday, and we're still celebrating. So I think he deserves at least 2 days of our time, and I think even more. I also have the uncomfortable sense that the Distinguished High Commissioner has already laid out many of the wonderful contributions of Gandhi, and I think what I can do best is kind of stick to my area of interest and really lay out what I see as a century of connection between the Gandhian movement and the African American civil rights struggle. That might surprise you in the sense that many people believe that began with Martin Luther King and his interest in Gandhi and going to India in 1959. But actually it started many decades before that. And I'd like to just read a letter, and it's from W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a contemporary of Gandhi. They were born roughly about the same time, and has Du Bois, William E.B. Du Bois, in many ways parallels Gandhi's life in the sense that he was a key figure in the development of the African American freedom struggle. He was a founder of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909. And that organization was the key instrument for many years of the civil rights struggle in the United States. And Du Bois was a person who provided many of the key ideas that still guide that struggle. In February 19th, 1929, he wrote a letter to Gandhi. By that time, Gandhi was already familiar to many African Americans. His exploits were reported in Black newspapers in the United States. So Du Bois wrote this letter, and I'll just read from it. I am the editor of a small magazine, he says, The Crisis. The Crisis was the magazine of the NAACP, which has a circulation of about 30,000 copies going among American Negroes. I very much want a message from you to these 12 million people who are the grandchildren of slaves, who additionally have great difficulties, despite great difficulties, moving forward in America. Can you grant this request? And Gandhi wrote back, and that letter was published in The Crisis. And it was part of that increasing involvement of African Americans, which Du Bois was at the center of, with the anti-colonial struggles going on around the world. Some of you may know that Du Bois was one of the founders of the Pan-African movement. And he worked tirelessly from the beginning of the 20th century to increase connections between African Americans and those struggling against colonialism elsewhere. Probably the next crucial I thought that I had unmuted myself.
Okay.
Now can you?
We can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Okay. Well, I've already given the first 5 minutes of my talk, but I'll just review it very briefly. And
it was just a couple of seconds, Dr. Carson, that you were cut off.
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, I was talking about the connections, the century-long connections between the African American struggle and the civil rights struggle in the United States, because I think that that's an important background for understanding where we are today. That this is not something that began recently in the 20th century, or even with Martin Luther King's trip to India in 1959, but it has been happening for most of the last 100 years. And I read from the letter, I'll just briefly go through that, from Du Bois in 1929 to Gandhi, in which he asked for Gandhi to write a note to African Americans. And Gandhi replied, and that letter was published in the Crisis in February of 1929. And it represented only part of the impact of the Gandhian struggle in India on African Americans. It was widely reported in Black newspapers in the United States. There was a great deal of interest. There was even an ashram in Harlem during the 1920s. But the most crucial event in this connection came in 1936, when a delegation led by Howard Thurman, a Black minister and educator at Howard University, who later actually ministered at a church in San Francisco, led a delegation to India in March of that year to meet with Gandhi. They had a day-long meeting, and they questioned Gandhi, and Gandhi questioned them about the situation of African Americans. And that dialogue, fortunately, was recorded for us. And we can see that those members of the Black delegation from the United States were asking critical questions of Gandhi, how his ideas might apply. Sue Bailey Thurman, the wife of Howard Thurman, a person I later got to know, told me about her question in this dialogue. And that was, what would Gandhi advise African Americans to do about the problem of lynching, about the problems of a white mob coming to lynch somebody in your family, kill them because of their race? And she was not overly satisfied with his answer, but she understood, and he explained how nonviolence, even in that situation, should be the answer. I could go into a lot more detail about this, but I think what I would like to emphasize is that after that 1936 trip, a large number of African Americans went to India to study the Gandhian movement. And they had a tremendous impact on Martin Luther King and the African American civil rights struggle. Among these were Benjamin Mays, who became president of Morehouse College when Martin Luther King was attending Morehouse College. And in his speeches to students at Morehouse, Benjamin Mays would often mention the example of the Gandhian movement. And Martin Luther King attributed those talks to his initial understanding of Gandhi. Another person who was key in this was James Farmer, who became the founder of one of the leading civil rights organizations, the Congress of Racial Equality during the 1940s. Another person in this list would be Bayard Rustin, who also went to India during the 1940s after Gandhi's assassination, came back and became an advisor to Martin Luther King throughout his life, and was actually the organizer of the March on Washington in 1963. So we can see from all of this that these individuals understood the importance of the Gandhian movement. And I'm leaving off perhaps the most important of these individuals, because he's still with us today, and that is James Lawson. I hope all of you are familiar with him. He's still a person who is in the struggle today. He was a person who trained to be a minister. He was also a pacifist. So during the American-Korean War, in the early 1950s, he refused to be drafted into the military. And part of his alternative service was to become a missionary in India. So he was there in the early 1950s, came back to the United States, and made contact with Martin Luther King. And from that point on in the 1950s, this is very soon after the Montgomery bus boycott, he and Bayard Rustin are both directly advising Martin Luther King in the aftermath of the Montgomery bus boycott. Bayard Rustin is one of the people who helps organize the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which is the organization that King led. So I think I'm reviewing some of this history just to make it clear that Martin Luther King did not come to Gandhi he would not have come to Gandhi without the advice and background of these various leaders. James Lawson also, even more important than his advice to Martin Luther King, he organized a workshop in Nashville, Tennessee during the late 1950s. And he brought together a group of young people in this workshop. And that group included many people whose names might be familiar. John Lewis, the distinguished congressman who recently passed away, was part of that group. C.T. Vivian, another person who died just a month or so ago. And Bernard Lafayette, who is still very much involved in struggles throughout the world. All of these individuals were part of this small workshop, and probably no more than about 15 or 20 people. But of those individuals, they became the leaders of what was called the sit-in movement of the 1960s, the freedom rides of the 1960s. And many of them became lifelong activists. The ones who are still alive are still very much active in the movements of the present. And so I think that this background suggests to me that indirectly or directly, the present generation of activists have an opportunity to learn a great deal from people who are not only influenced by the Gandhian legacy, but I would argue they have transformed that legacy into a global legacy. One of the ways in which I would view the Black Gandhians is that they proved to the world that Gandhi's ideas can apply every place in the world. And they were able to take those ideas and turn them into strategies that have continued to impact the African American struggle, so that even young people who probably think of Gandhi as simply a photo or a portrait on the wall understand his ideas through through the people who have developed and carried on his ideas. And the question I guess I would leave you with is that Martin Luther King's last book was, where do we go from here? And I think that in some respects, he is doing what Gandhi was doing during the last years of his life in terms of what will be the legacy of my life. And in this last book, Where Do We Go From Here? He asks this question, and he provides us with a metaphor. He says that he compares the situation of humanity to inheriting a world house. And this world house is filled with people of different cultures, different backgrounds, but they all must learn to live together in this world house. And I think that it was a challenge because he said, in the title of the book, we have two alternatives, chaos or community. So I feel that our mission and the mission of the Gandhi Peace Council, I hope all of us share this mission, is to try to think of, if you take that metaphor and ask the question, what is the knowledge that young people need to live in the World House? And I think we would understand that it is a global knowledge rather than simply a knowledge of their own societies. It is the knowledge that is enriched by Gandhi's ideas, by Martin Luther King's ideas, by Nelson Mandela's ideas, and as the High Commissioner pointed out, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Dalai Lama, a person I've met, all of these individuals have in various ways told us that Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King are not simply people from the past, but are people whose ideas still live in the present, that they are the inspiration for the movements we see now. And I've been so impressed by the young people, particularly in the United States, but inspiring protests around the world during the last few months. During this difficult period, they are a source of inspiration that the world is going to be a better place. And one way in which I could express their impact is that my life as an activist started in 1963 when I attended the March on Washington. And there were 200,000 people there. And I was very impressed. I grew up in a small town in New Mexico, and I had never seen so many people. That was probably larger than the population of the state at that time. And yet, within days of the murder of George Floyd in the United States, young people, most of them in their teens and 20s, had organized protests vastly larger than the March on Washington and vastly more sustained than simply one day. So I think that we look forward to a future in which these young people, still in their teens, in their 20s, are going to transform the world. And I think that this effort to celebrate the life of Gandhi and all the celebrations that will be going on in January about King's life, I think are going to give new life to their legacies. So I'm very happy to be with you on this occasion, and I look forward to whatever questions people have. Sorry about the technical problem before, but it's still early in the morning here, so excuse me.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. Very inspiring and learned words. I'm sure people already who are participating have questions, burning questions. So I'll just, before we move to Dr. Devji, I would just like to let people know that if they have questions already on the tip of the tongue, to text that to the host of the Zoom call, Dr. Humar, and he's going to kind of keep a running ticker of questions and pick and choose those that he'll politely lob at our two panelists during the open Q&A. So thank you, Dr. Carson, for your opening remarks, and now I'll transition to Dr. Devji for his opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Rahil. It really is a privilege to be speaking to you today, to have been invited by the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council of Ottawa in the presence of your distinguished guests, the High Commissioner of India and the President of Carleton University, and a particular privilege to share virtually, though it may be, a stage with Professor Carson. Now, what I want to do today is to say something about Gandhi's thoughts on race, but to approach these thoughts, as it were, from what appears to be their opposite from the idea of humanity. We normally tend to contrast racism or race thinking and race identity with humanity and humanitarianism as being a somehow more universal form of inclusive identity. But this contrast actually bears some reflection, and Gandhi, typically of him, subjected this contrast to sustained reflection, and I'd like to say a few words about it. Now, to begin with, of course, the idea of humanity was important for Gandhi because it was also part of the ideological repertoire of imperialism. The British Empire presented itself in a humanitarian guise and advanced its practices in places like India as a humanitarian gift, creating an obligation among its subjects. The thing about this gift, of course, is that it set aside any idea of contract or of agreement or indeed of conversation, to say nothing of acquiescence. The gift was unilateral because Indian subjects were unable to engage in any conversation with the British Raj and were not deemed to be its equals. Indeed, the British Raj often presented itself by a logic of what today we might call humanitarian intervention. And this logic went back, indeed, to the abolition of slavery by Britain itself. You may know that in the aftermath of that abolition, the Royal Navy was tasked with breaking what at that time was international law by seizing suspected slave cargo on the high seas in an act precisely of humanitarian intervention. Clearly a virtuous act, but one that was at the same time joined up with other acts such as bombardments of colonial territories and other forms of very violent intervention, which were also given the name of humanitarianism. So when Gandhi started to think about nonviolence, he had to deal with this ideology of humanity and humanitarianism, not least because it was so characteristic of the self-justification of imperialism. An imperialism, to repeat, that was premised upon a gift given by Britain in this case to her subjects in other parts of the world, a gift that was not about contract, about agreement, about certainly about democracy. Now, what Gandhi tried to do in his early activism in South Africa was to reverse this obligation that was created supposedly by the gift of empire. And we know that he did this in his ambulance corps in the Boer War of the late 19th century and the so-called Zulu War, otherwise known as the Bambata Rebellion in the early, both in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries, where he leads Indian volunteers in these ambulance corps, and these volunteers are meant to take care of both sides, wounded men on both sides of the political rift. And this was an example of a unilateral gift, a gift given back to the empire to create an obligation among the British themselves. So it was an attempt to turn British humanitarian ideology on its head, as it were. Yet, even as he was doing this, Gandhi was deeply suspicious of the language of humanity and what had become of it in imperialism. So as early as his fundamental text, Hind Swaraj, or Indian Home Rule of 1909, Gandhi criticizes the idea of humanity. He thinks that speaking in the name of humanity, speaking for the human race, was simply a sign of pride and hubris. How could any nation or person or world leader claim to speak on behalf of this vast concourse of people without any representative capacity? He also saw this hubris as coming out of a sense of capitalist technology, which is what allowed the British to conquer different parts of the world and to claim, therefore, to speak on behalf of those who had become their subjects. He also understood this form of speaking in the name of humanity or for it as a practice that sacrificed necessarily means for ends. And the High Commissioner, I think, has already mentioned to us how Gandhi was so intent on the virtue of means, which should not be sacrificed to ends. Whereas when you think of humanity in a purely biological or demographic way, as a sheer number and scale of population, then you might be tempted to sacrifice smaller numbers for larger ones. And this, of course, Gandhi was very critical of. So in all of these ways, he took an idea, the idea of humanity, and a practice, the practice of humanitarianism, and tried to disentangle them from the way in which they had become embroiled in imperial and imperialist enterprises. In the past, of course, ideas such as that of humanity had been defined not in demographic or biological terms at all. Being human had been defined in philosophical and moral and religious terms, whether these had to do with compassion or sacrifice or doing one's duty. But these pre-modern ideas of defining the human were by the late 19th century subordinated to biological and demographic ones of the kind that I have tried to describe. And for Gandhi, this was particularly disturbing because he thought it made humanity partake of the same logic as racism. So the very categories that are meant to be opposed to one another ended up looking very much alike. How was this? Because like racism, the idea of humanity in its modern incarnation, an imperialist form, tended to be defined by similarity and similitude, right? Where a human being is defined as someone who shares something biological very often with others who are defined as human beings, who these figures are meant to share a language, they are meant to communicate with each other, and language or communication, of course, is one of the crucial definitions of the human. They are meant to share food, of course. They are meant to share sexual relations. Now, all of these are biological relations. And Gandhi is very disturbed by them because he understands, as I suggested just now, that this is simply racism writ large. That if you define humanity in purely biological terms as a set of similarities and similitudes, then what really is the difference between racial identity, which is simply a narrow version of this kind of human identity? What does he do? He contrasts this way of thinking about humanity to a non-biological one that is not premised upon similarity and similitude. And he calls this other way of thinking about the human humanitarianism, but humanitarianism of a very different kind than humanitarian intervention. And one of the places, one of the sites in which he does this is when thinking about interspecies relations between human beings and non-human life. The occasion, of course, for Gandhi to approach these relations had to do with the sacredness of animal life in Hinduism in particular, and the figure of the sacred cow, specifically. And what Gandhi does is he says that the sacredness of the cow and the sacredness of non-human life, and of all human life indeed, is premised upon a logic that is not a biological logic, that is not about similarity and similitude. Because how can you conceive of relations between humans and non-humans? They do not share a language. They are not part of the same food ecology. And they do not share sexual and reproductive relations. Their relations in many ways are non-biological. They are biological in some indirect ways, of course, because cattle and other domesticated animals support human life. So for Gandhi, it was the relations between human and non-human life that served as the truer model for humanitarianism, precisely because they made for relations that are not defined by similarity and similitude, and that are not biological, but indeed are moral. And for him, it was these relations that were called humanitarian, because they allowed humanity to actually go beyond itself. This is a way of thinking about the human, which is not about defining everyone within the same. It's about opening up. It's about opening to the other, opening to the outside. And for him, this served as by far the most productive way of thinking about both human relations and relations among human beings and non-human life. Now, of course, this way of thinking entailed another kind of unilateralism. You know, the British Empire's unilateralism was that it offered itself as a gift, ostensibly, to its subjects. For Gandhi, human and non-human relations were also offered as a gift, because you couldn't really know what the animal wanted. You didn't share a language with the animal. They were defined, these relations, therefore, by duty. Duty as an obligation of a very different kind than that the British Empire conceived of, right? So for the British Empire, its humanitarian acts created or were meant to create an obligation among its subjects. For Gandhi, the obligation was not a return. So you did your duty by non-human life and indeed by human life, but you did not expect a return gift, as it were. You did not expect the animal to have an obligation towards you. Your duty was unilateral in that sense. And he went further to speculate, or to reflect, I should say, philosophically, on the virtue of duty. Now, I want to end with that because we tend to think of humanity and humanitarianism in the language of rights. Gandhi was much more interested in the language of duty. Dharma is the Sanskrit word for it, but you can just as well use the English one. And let me give you an example of this. So in 1948, or around the end of 1947, 1947, of course, marks the independence of India and the partition of British India. Gandhi receives a letter from Julian Huxley, who was at that time director of UNESCO. And Julian Huxley is writing to Gandhi. He writes to many eminent figures because he is part of the drafting committee of a document that eventually becomes the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with the United Nations. And Huxley asks Gandhi what he thinks about rights, and Gandhi writes back to him and says he doesn't think much of them, actually, because you cannot conceive of rights without duties. Those two things are paired. Rights, Gandhi suggests, are in fact never inalienable. They're always given by states. And therefore they can be taken away by states, even though we call them inalienable. Duties, on the other hand, are truly individual. They belong to each one of us. We ought to know what our duties are, and we ought to fulfill those duties. No one can take away your duty. Now, just as rights are defined by life, because the primary right, of course, is the right to life. And Gandhi clearly would have been for this. But for Gandhi, more important in some ways was duty, because the primary duty is the duty to die, sacrifice. So there are many rights. Of course, there are rights to habitation and to food and to employment. And the right to life is only the most basic, but also the, if you will, most supreme of rights. Similarly with duties, which are sacrificial in nature, there are many kinds of duties. The duties to your families, to your loved ones, to your neighbors, to your fellow citizens, to animals, as Gandhi would argue. But the primary duty, of course, is the duty to give your own life in a moral cause. And for Gandhi, it was duty that was crucial. There is another anecdote I would like to end with, this time from 1937. In 1937, you have someone called Rudolf von Strunk, who comes to see Gandhi in Segao, I think, at Varda, at his ashram. And Rudolf von Strunk is a Nazi. He had been responsible for supplying arms to the fascists in the Spanish Civil War. And he came to see Gandhi because he was interested in issues precisely of life and of health. The Nazis were very interested in life and health, though only the life and health of their own race. Right? And when he speaks to Gandhi, Gandhi says to him, look at the violence of the Spanish Civil War. And von Strunk says, yes, isn't it terrible? And Gandhi says, no, you don't understand me. What's objectionable about the Spanish Civil War is not the fact that you give up your lives. That is actually wonderful, that you're capable of doing that. And we Indians should learn from you. What is truly objectionable is not giving up your life. What is truly objectionable is the fact that you kill while doing so, that you kill others. And you kill others because you value life more. That killing is about killing others, of course, is linked to protecting or promoting your own lives and the lives of those you conceive of as people like you. In other words, in the case of the Nazis, of course, the so-called Aryan race. And it is that which is truly objectionable. If you give up your desire for life and for the promotion of life and for the promotion of lives of those who are like you, then you can open yourself up to nonviolence. And that truly is virtue. So that there is something deeply problematic in the valorization of life in this manner. And therefore it is duty and sacrifice that defines what nonviolence is. And oddly, paradoxically, for Gandhi, it was duty, and duty is always sacrificial. And the primary sacrifice, of course, is inevitably death. It is that which is more capable of protecting life than the ideology of protecting life itself. So let me end here by suggesting that when Gandhi thinks about race and racial identity, he does so by approaching it from what is ostensibly its opposite, the category of humanity and of humanitarianism. And when we trace his thinking, we come to what appears to be a rather paradoxical set of conclusions, but ones that I think really merit our continued attention because they allow us to rethink both these terms and to understand that race and humanity are curiously intertwined with one another. And in order to make a truly non-violent life possible, a non-racist life, we need to disentangle them very, very carefully. And that is something that Gandhi himself did throughout his career. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Devji. Again, very insightful, powerful, and provocative kind of opening remarks for us. I'm sure it's prompted as well a number of questions from our participants. And before I kind of go into our bit of our warm-up session of canned questions for our panelists, I'd just like to remind them that the audience can direct any of their questions to the host of the Zoom call, Dr. Humar, who will pick and choose from the list of interesting questions that he receives. I'm now going to move on to a bit of a choreographed Q&A with our distinguished guest panelists. And as mentioned, I'm doing a bit of a tag team with my fellow MGPC board member, Anne Vallely, who is also a professor of religious studies at the University of Ottawa here in town. So I'm going to start off with a question that either will hit home with both of the panelists or one more than other, depends on how they kind of, if they feel it kind of responds to their laneway, so to speak. You know, we just heard how Mahatma Gandhi influenced a number of early civil rights leaders beyond Martin Luther King. And it was also kind of at the end of Dr. Carson's talk connected to contemporary movements, particularly the Black Lives Matter movement, and how there's some learnings to be adopted in the context of that movement. The question I would ask both panelists to start off is, you know, why was Mahatma Gandhi so inspirational to African Americans of that early period of the civil rights movement, in light of the fact that they were facing so much violence and oppression, and the instinctive response would have been counter-violence? And then translating it to today's time, as we're confronting different kinds of inequalities in American society and other societies, how would Mahatma Gandhi, how would his insights help inform movements today like the Black Lives Matter movement, which don't actually revolve around a charismatic personality per se? They're kind of organic and mass movements without a face at the front, so to speak. So I'd like to first throw that question out to Dr. Carson, and then Dr. Devji, happy to respond as well afterwards.
That I turn my sound back on now. I think that part of my work in terms of understanding the what I call the African American freedom struggle is to debunk the idea that it relied on Martin Luther King. I strongly believe, and I've written this on a number of occasions, that the movement would have happened pretty much as it did if Martin Luther King had never been born. I'll leave it to scholars of Gandhi to decide whether that would be true in India. But I think very strongly that the strength of the movement came from its grassroots dimension. Just to put a concrete example, Rosa Parks, who launched the Montgomery bus boycott, was not in any way dependent on Martin Luther King. He did not advise her to do that. He did not have anything to do with her decision to do that. And the boycott that followed from that, Martin Luther King had nothing whatsoever to do with organizing it. It was organized by Black women in Montgomery. It was 100% successful. Every leader should be so fortunate to have a successful movement handed to him and said, okay, we've organized the boycott. It's already successful. Your job is to inspire it and keep it going. And so I think that that's true for the sit-ins. It's true for the freedom rides. It's true for the Montgomery campaign. It's true for the March on Washington. He did not organize that. He did not organize the voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama. So I think that sometimes, you know, and I've carried on this dialogue with other historians, that they're fascinated by the charismatic leader because that leader leaves behind a trail of documents and ideas and books and articles and speeches and interviews that they can mine for insights. And that, but I would argue that that's more a commentary on the movement, an interpretation, the leader's interpretation of the movement. The movement is not reliant on that. And I think one of the reasons why the current movement doesn't have a charismatic leader is they've read books like mine. They understand that that was both a strength and a weakness of the movements of the 1960s. That if you have the charismatic leader, that leader can be assassinated. That leader can be compromised. That leader can be shown as not living up to their own values. So in general, but I'd really like to respond to my fellow panelists. I thought there was a very insightful talk, and maybe I could just take this time to address the question to you, and that is, one of the things about duty, though, is that it can be imposed, it can be required. And I wonder how that fits into your sense of the difference between the assertion of rights, which can be asserted and denied, but also duties can be imposed on oneself, adopted by oneself, but also required. Do your duty is a phrase that every human being understands. So I'm just wondering if I could get your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, thank you very much. First of all, I entirely agree with Professor Carson about the figure of the charismatic leader. Now, you couldn't find, in a way, a more charismatic 20th century figure than Gandhi, of course. And he knew this. And precisely because he knew this, he tried throughout his life to behave in such a way and to speak in such a way that in a way that he thought anyone might. Right? So when you look at his autobiography, he says, I will not be saying anything in this autobiography, nor recommending anything in it that even a child could neither understand nor perform. Right? He's very intent on this. And just as Professor Carson was saying, Gandhi's practices, he doesn't necessarily invent. He finds them, he expands them. He's very important in expanding them. These ideas of dharana, of in what Gujarati is called risamanu, of objecting non-violently to something. They existed in places like Kathiawar, where Gandhi was brought up. He saw them being practiced by people like his mother, a very great influence upon him, and he decided to elaborate them and to expand them. So when you look, for instance, even at his key term, satyagraha, truth force, how does he come up with it? This is not Gandhi, the charismatic thinker. He actually advertises in his journal, Indian Opinion, in South Africa, for a name. And people send in suggestions, and he has a committee, and they look over these suggestions, and he likes one and he plays with it, and that's how you come up with satyagraha. You cannot think of a more democratic way of coming up with what will prove to be an absolutely crucial category for nonviolence. So crucial that even people who are normally thought about as Gandhi's enemies, like the very famous and important Dalit thinker, Dr. Ambedkar, even Ambedkar uses satyagraha to the end of his life, and he knows where it comes from. He understands his indebtedness, not to Gandhi. Gandhi has just advertised and come up with this term, but this is a term that is collectively brought forward. So Gandhi wrestles with this idea of his own charismatic personality and tries to reduce it, as he often said, to zero. Now, to address Professor Carson's question, to me, yeah, I think of course, you're right. A duty, do your duty especially, is the kind of thing that armies tend to tell their recruits. And Gandhi, of course, is deeply suspicious of this. So he thinks that you need to, each individual needs to discover what their individual duty is. And this duty is called swadharma, one's own duty in Sanskrit. And you have to discover what your duty is individually, not as a class of people. And you do that by trying to understand the context in which you're placed and the relations in which you're placed with others around you. And for Gandhi, the exemplary instance of this is the great war of the Mahabharata, of the Indian epic, the Mahabharata, in which the hero Arjuna is led by his divine charioteer Krishna to the middle of the battlefield. It's a very famous scene. And he faces an army of people who include many of his own relations and preceptors and others. And he has to decide whether he should leave or go. And the great dialogue of the Bhagavad Gita is, of course, where his charioteer Krishna tells him that his duty is indeed to stay and fight. And why is it to stay and fight is the mission of the Gita to explain. Now, that is an exemplary sight of this issue of how do you discover what your duty is. In the case of the Bhagavad Gita, there has to be a dialogue. There has to be an understanding by Arjuna of why he is placed where he is, and why if he flees the battlefield, the battle will occur anyway, but the forces of evil might win rather than those of goodness. So what is it that brings him there? How has he come to be on that battlefield in the first place? And what should his duty be in these circumstances? So in a way, it's a perfect example of how each individual must choose and decide upon what their duty is, rather than having it dictated to them by a state or an army or a preceptor or anyone else for that matter. So what appears to be an authoritative scriptural text, the Bhagavad Gita, for Gandhi also becomes, if you will, almost a Socratic text, where it's not meant to just tell you what to do. It teaches you how to think about what you should do, how to discover your own duty against any duty that is suggested to you by anyone else.
I don't want to prevent other questions from being asked. I would just say that maybe one of the things that Gandhi would do would be to decide there should be two different words for duty, the internal one and the external one. And so that our language would reflect that.
Okay, well, thank you to both of you. And actually, it'd be fascinating just to hear you both kind of discuss between yourselves, and we just watch and listen. I do have, we have a few questions. So Anne, I was going to kind of defer to you for the next kind of prepared question for our distinguished panelists.
Yeah, I think I'll take that over. Thank you, Rahil, and thank you both, Dr. Carson and Devji, for your truly inspiring, very remarkable presentations. It feels like a tremendous honor to be here. And on the basis of your presentations, your scholarship, your activism, as well actually as the comments by the Distinguished High Commissioner, I think we can anticipate the answers to these canned questions, as Rahil is defining them. Nevertheless, I think there's a value just in posing them and asking the questions, and please feel free to take them in whichever direction you want. And I suppose I'll just ask the questions to both of you. I think here, all of us are united in considering Gandhi's views on rights, on human rights, and actually on perhaps non-human rights as well, and ideas about duty as not being restricted to any particular time and place, but having relevance today. And so our question is simply that: in what ways are these ideas, these anti or non-anthropocentric humanitarian ideals of relevance today? Perhaps I could ask Dr. Devji to start, and then Dr. Carson. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I think, particularly in our own time, of course, when we are dealing with climate change, with the possibility of species extinction, Gandhi has, I think the High Commissioner mentioned this, one way in which Gandhi has returned to public consciousness in many parts of the world is because of what is taken as being his ecological thinking. Not so much his thinking about interspecies relations, though I happen to think that actually that's very important and follows upon the ecological thinking. Now, what's crucial about his ecological thinking, which is of course a term that is anachronistic, it would not have been used in his own day, is that Gandhi is a thinker of self-imposed limits. And this goes back to something Professor Carson was saying, because that's another sense in which duty becomes what it is. So he thinks he's critical of the logic of infinite expansion and growth that characterized industrial capitalism in his day, in the late 19th century, especially in a place like Johannesburg, which was at the very epicenter of the empire's industrial capitalism, with its mines and its great city and all the rest, its mines and its factories, even more so than in India, actually. And so for Gandhi, infinite hunger, infinite expansion, infinite growth, even if it brings prosperity to a few, is something that's deeply damaging, he thinks, because it emphasizes the hubristic idea of humanity that I was trying to describe in my talk by setting aside and degrading even further than as was already the case, non-human life, and preventing any real kind of interaction between species. So how do you think about limits, about, if you will, what is today called degrowth? Not in a nostalgic way of, we're going to return to the past and to the village of the past, but in a way that realizes what he thinks of as the addiction of infinite growth, of the idea, and of course the unsustainability of it, and the violence embodied in it. So, we need to take his ecological and economic thinking and transfer it to our current day concerns with interspecies relations and animal life in particular. And and that should prompt us to think about what a moral subject is and what unilateral relations might be, since our relations with animals tend to be, by default, unilateral. They're not based on an exchange of language and reasoning and all the things that have in the past defined human relations. And as I was trying to suggest, Gandhi even is so bold as to suggest that it's there. It's at the level of interspecies relations, that is that which might provide the model even for relations between human beings. So rather than anthropomorphizing non-human life by saying we should treat animals as if they were persons, he's doing the opposite. He's saying, actually, let's look at our relations with animals and see how that might provide a non-anthropomorphic and non-anthropocentric way of thinking about relations between human beings.
I would extend what you've just said in the sense that one of the ways in which the 20th century has brought together what I would call ideas about ecology, interdependence, taking away human life as the center of the purpose of everything. When I was growing up, I wanted to be a scientist, and I grew up in Los Alamos, and I was around many of the people who developed the ideas about how we understand the universe. And obviously, since the discovery that the Earth was not the center of the solar system, that has very gradually taken away some of the hubris of humanity. But now in the discoveries of the 20th century about physics, we know with almost mathematical certainty that the sun will expand and explode and we'll all be gone, and the universe will go on. And I don't think that knowledge, when I was talking about King's metaphor of the world house, of what is the necessary knowledge that all human beings need to know to live in the world house? Well, maybe I should say the world house is the universe. What is the necessary knowledge we need to know to understand that we are in a small planet around a medium-sized star, and in the scheme of the universe, when that famous King phrase, the moral arm of the universe, we don't have a clue about what the moral arm of the universe is. And I think that kind of human human-centric view of everything, of even our sense of morality, I think that's being questioned, and I'm hoping that the understanding of the ecology of the earth in terms of climate change and other things such as this, that I think young people have a better understanding than some of their parents. Greta is a teenager, and she's had a great impact in terms of kind of lecturing to her elders about things that they should know. So I think that's the beginning of a changing worldview in which Gandhi and King both play a role in terms of undermining that notion that we are the purpose of the universe. We're not the purpose of the universe. The universe would do quite well if an asteroid came along and we're no longer there, any more than we care about the ants in an anthill. It gets plowed under. So I think that humility, maybe that's their most important message to us. Humility. And that's a lesson that I think that the penalty for not, we can ignore a lot of the things that they recommend in terms of violence and nonviolence. I think that's the one thing that we can't ignore, that we're not who we think we are in terms of the purpose of life or the purpose of the universe. So, and I think the fact that young people perhaps can understand that better than their parents is something that is very hopeful for the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Anne, sorry, I'll let you for the next one.
Well, actually, I think in the interest of time, I just wanted to thank both our speakers. That was very rich, but also in the interest of time, either to Rahil, let you ask the last question, or perhaps then to move on to the general questions and answers.
Yeah, I think we have about 20 minutes left. So why don't we pivot to our general Q&A. If Dr. Humar, if you've received any questions up to now, and if not,
yes,
I'll
yep. I have 7 or 8 questions, and I'll ask them in the order which I have received. First question from Rajesh. Can Gandhi's principle bring transformative changes that are needed today to counter racism, violence, and to promote inclusive leadership? And what lessons can we take from his teaching that can be applied in practical terms? I'd like Dr. Carson to address this first.
Well, I think what we've been saying is that that maybe their best basic lessons to us is humility. The arrogance of racism is something that in the last several centuries has brought a huge amount of destruction, genocide to the world. And I think you know, the whole notion that this imperialist project was seen as bringing civilization to the world is part of what a generation of historians, I think, and scholars have tried to address. And I don't think it's an accident that Einstein was an anti-racist. You know, I think the two things go together. Yeah, so the brief answer is that King's last message, you know, that title of his book, Where Do We Go From Here? It seems to me that the crucial word is we. You know, we can't really decide where we are going to go unless we decide who's the relevant we. Who are we going to get there with? Is it going to be with people like ourselves? Is it going to be with, and we know in the world as it is, that's not likely. So I would say we can't answer the question, where do we go from here, until we figure out who we're going to get to a future with. And it better be the right answer.
Dr. Devji, would you like to add something to this?
Only to say that, yes, I entirely agree with what Professor Carson has just said. And to add there that for someone like Gandhi, this is why truth is such an important category for him. You know, he moves from saying God is truth, to truth is God. You know, that he places truth, as it were, before God. And that's so important for him because you cannot do anything in the cause of justice without being attentive to truth, and yet without being able to know it at the same time. So the link between truth and God is made precisely because you can never fully know it. You can never own it. It doesn't belong to you. This goes back to what Professor Carson was saying about who or what gets to be at the center of these activities. And I think that, again, what Professor Carson was saying earlier, what we have seen even very recently, whether it is these extraordinary and inspiring and totally unexpected protests after the brutal killing of George Floyd that erupted not only in the United States, but around the world. And the other example he offered, that of Greta Thunberg and the young children, indeed, who have risen up to become our conscience for climate change. These are signs. There are many obstacles, of course, but these are signs of great hope because these examples both tell us that this is the future speaking to us. You know, and children especially are by definition our future. And Gandhi, not accidentally, I think, was one of the very few modern thinkers for whom children were truly moral agents. And he thought they were moral agents precisely because not only did they represent the future, but strangely, as children, they were not in charge of it. As a child is in charge of his or her, you know, parents and teachers and others, you know, they don't supposedly have self-control. And for Gandhi, it was this which made them true moral agents, precisely because they were dependent and not independent, because they were able to think about our present more deeply than those who were willing to sacrifice that present for the future in the way that financial speculation and investments in the future are made. So for Gandhi, the child is the true moral agent, not despite the fact that they lack independence, if you will, but precisely because of it. And in a way, it's an example of how nonviolence and the freedom that it gives rise to is possible anywhere and everywhere. Just as ahimsa is possible in the middle of a battlefield, so too a being such as a child who appears to be someone who we adults should protect. Yet for Gandhi, it is children and women and the enslaved and the immiserated who are the true hopes for the future, because that is where justice is going to emerge from. They are not merely the victims who need our protection or saving.
Thank you. The next question for Dr. Carson. How is humanitarian sector to be effective in today's environment, where power structure from countries who can give money to be utilized in areas of conflict, refugees, and at the same time blocking of refugees from reaching any safe place? How is humanitarian sector have to perform and be effective under those circumstances? This is from Indu.
Well, if the question is, how can you make what I would call civil society more powerful?
Yes.
That is the central question. And I think, there are three sources of institutionalized power in the world. And, the nation is one. And since the French and the American Revolution, we've kind of sometimes placed our hope for human rights. These nations founded on human rights principles. And we found that the nation is not a very good instrument for protecting human rights. It's got other priorities like protecting borders and protecting itself from, and the other is obviously the economy. And I think when you look at Adam Smith, he kind of felt that, eventually it works out for the common good and all of that sort of thing. But we've seen in the 21st century that multinationals act for reasons that make no ecological sense, make no human sense, but make sense for themselves. So we have the civil society. And the problem with that is that, you go into most sessions like this, and I give lots of talks, and when you say, do you believe in human rights, everybody will raise their hands. But it's meaningless because they're uncoordinated except for exceptions, like the anti-apartheid movement. It would be a big exception. That was a movement. It was not nation states that ended apartheid. It was not corporations. They were quite willing to get along with apartheid. Ultimately, it was pressure from civil society, boycotts that started where individuals, like those attending this session, put pressure on their government, put pressure on corporations, put pressure on banks to do the right thing. And to me, that's the hope for the future of how do you coordinate that? How do you build that power, people power? How do you coordinate that at a global level? To me, that's why I'm sitting here on a Saturday morning talking on this session, is that this is part of that effort to use technology, which is neutral, for good. And I think that's our hope, is that we, by using instruments such as Zoom, we learn to coordinate with people around the world. All those people who are convinced that human rights is a good thing and it should be protected around the world. To translate that basic human assumption into a powerful force, capable of challenging nations, capable of challenging corporations. And that is where I see the hope. That's why, what grew out of our conference last year was the Gandhi King Global Network. And that's what we are trying to implement with all of our minimal resources. But given our minimal resources, I think we've made enormous progress since that day when a member of a person who was inspired by the Gandhi legacy walked in my office about 13 years ago and said, let's bring our movements together. And it's absolutely astounding to me what has happened in my life, his life, in just this past decade. So I see hope in that we can begin to mobilize people to do what nations should do, what nations promised to do when they were founded. And I think that we can do that. Whether we can do it soon enough to prevent what King called chaos is another question.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. If Dr. Devji would like to add comments, brief comments on this, and I'll also pose the next question to you, Dr. Devji. This is from Nan Tandon. Did Gandhi draw any inspiration from the Quran? So,
thank you. Yes, he did actually. And, you know, Gandhi even wrote an introduction to a life of the Prophet Muhammad. So, though it's rare to find. So, as you know, he embarks quite early in his career on a quite deep study of various religions. Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Islam is one of them. And you will not be surprised to learn that for Gandhi, the life of the Prophet in Mecca in his earlier career is very inspiring. You know, when the Prophet is actually fighting against all odds and is doing so non-violently. You know, he suffers the insults and taunts of others. Gandhi is also very keen on the martyrs of early Islam. In particular, the Imams, you know, Ali and Hussein, who die as martyrs. And he routinely draws examples from that history. As far as the Quran itself is concerned, you know, he thinks that there are obviously differences between different scriptures, but there are also things that they share. And for Gandhi, it's important to look at the things that are not objectionable and to make those the basis of relations between different religions. He also thinks that the advantage of religious plurality, as of every other kind of plurality, including biological plurality, is that it allows for new ideas to enter the world. That no religion, he says, has the absolute monopoly on truth. But every religion has some bit of it. And it's only when we get to know other religions that we are able both to examine our own presuppositions and our own beliefs, but also allow those believers in other religions to do the same with regard to us. So today, of course, we would call this the virtue in diversity. And I don't mean simply diversity as a nice ideal, as a virtue of necessity, that we happen to be in diverse societies and therefore we must value them. No, even in a kind of properly scientific context, diversity is, as we know, a strength. And for Gandhi, it's a strength that makes possible learning from each other, but also examination, self-examination, that the example of another should allow us to examine what we think and what we believe, and we see our reflection in those of the other. So he doesn't want people to all become the same thing, whether it's religiously or in any other way. For him, plurality is crucial precisely because no one possesses a monopoly of truth, and plurality is what allows us to learn about ourselves and about others and to improve ourselves vis-a-vis each other. Otherwise, there would be no hope for improvement. If the truth were already known by one group or one person, nothing more would be needed and nothing more would be possible. But clearly that is not the case.
Thank you. This is a question addressed to Dr. Carson and perhaps to Dr. Devji from Noel Salmond. Could Dr. Carson comment on current critiques of Gandhi's relationship or perhaps lack thereof during his years in South Africa with Black South Africans?
Yes, obviously that has become an issue in terms of people objecting to statues of Gandhi because of his racist comments while soon after arriving in South Africa. And, I kind of put this in the same category as those who criticize Martin Luther King for some of his remarks, which they interpret as sexist, like the fact that he wanted Coretta to stay at home and take care of the kids, and that was part of his insistence when they got married, even though she was more of an activist than he was at the time when they met. I think for historians, we understand that trying to inject present day attitudes back into the past is not very useful. And it goes, the only purpose of doing it would be to see these figures as charismatic, that they are in some ways conveying truth from God. And if you don't look at them that way and look at them as they really were, as human beings, flawed human beings, Gandhi, according to present day attitudes, raped his wife. She was not old enough to give consent. So, once we begin to make these kinds of assumptions, I think, to me, what they do is say, well, since the charismatic leader was flawed, I can be flawed too. And which makes no sense, of course. To me, if the charismatic leader had flaws, we should look at that as saying, oh, there's hope for me because I know that I'm flawed. So I think that's the way I would look at it.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. Dr. Devji, any comments on this one?
Well, I don't think I have that much to add, except to say that, yes, of course, and Gandhi would have been the first to acknowledge his many flaws and many faults. He never did otherwise. He never made any claims to sainthood or superhuman virtue. And that is indeed what he thought made his life instructive for others, not because it was so good, but because it was so fallible. He writes his autobiography to say, look, I am as fallible, everyone is fallible, and here is a story of a fallible man, like any other. And it is a story of someone who tries, maybe not always successfully, to become a better human being. So I think I entirely agree with Professor Carson that, curiously, it is Gandhi's critics who would like to see him as a saint and as a perfect figure. And they are constantly disappointed by him because, of course, he's not that particular kind of figure. But then there is nothing to learn from such a figure, from a superhuman figure. There is everything to learn precisely from someone like Gandhi, who said that he was like everyone else, and indeed probably worse than many people. And he understood nonviolence to be not the attributes of superhuman figures and saints, but a set of views and practices that were available to everyone. And surely that is what should draw our attention. Now, there's much more that can be said about Gandhi's views of race and views of Africans, but we have to note that he there are things to be said on both sides of that question, that Gandhi also has many very positive things to say about Africans and African Americans in particular. He has negative things to say when he's in South Africa, arguing the case for the Gujarati merchant elite in South African courts of law, which are based on racial distinctions. And so in order to maintain the privileges, such as they were, of the Gujarati merchant class whom he represented, he made racial arguments. Now, whether he made those simply as a lawyer or whether he believed in them is an open question. And it's a question that is worth asking over and over again. But otherwise, I entirely agree with Professor Carson.
Thank you, Dr. Devji. This is a question maybe Dr. Devji may like to address. And then I have one more observation rather than a question. So this is the last question and then followed by one observation. This is from Raju Bhatt. He says, recently I reached out to Arun Gandhi and he said he was very tired from all the proactive work over the years and felt that things were very political in the Indian subcontinent and a lack of political will come to settlement. How do we help the peacekeepers to keep the vision that they planted? How do we support the ones who are doing the amazing work without being able to guarantee the final result of peace of the Indian subcontinent? I've read it as it was posed.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer. And all I can say is that, echoing what the High Commissioner said in his opening remarks, that whether it is in Pakistan or India or Bangladesh or any other South Asian country which has had experience of Gandhi's life and work, even in the most unpromising contexts, you find people embarking upon satyagrahas and acts and practices of non-violence. And we have seen this continuously in the history of independent India. In particular, ecological movements in India and feminist movements in India have made explicit reference to Gandhi. They have also been explicitly non-violent. And so there's a long history of this, and it is one that will continue, and not just in India. Again, referring to the High Commissioner's comments, I had a television interview with a Pakistani station a month or so ago on Gandhi, and I spoke about him, and there were many appreciative comments. And just to say that even there, and perhaps especially there, where a new fight for democracy is emerging, someone like Gandhi remains important. How could he not? We should not forget that when Gandhi went on his last fast unto death in 1948, by the time he broke that fast, this is during the horrors of partition, the violence of partition, violence had stopped both in India and Pakistan. And while he was fasting, he was getting letters from Pakistan saying, we regret our violence, please abandon your fast. So, even at the moment of what appeared to be the greatest breakdown of law and order in the subcontinent's modern history, the moment of the greatest violence, even then, this was possible. If it was possible then, it is possible now and possible in the future.
Thank you. The final one is an observation. This is from Naomi Caligaro, and said that Ila Gandhi said that the concept of satyagraha came from her grandmother, Kasturba. Ila said that her grandmother felt that he was not really making any progress with his ways and was inspired by the way that Kasturba kept bringing him into line when he was out of order. In fact, she goes on to say, Ila Gandhi said that her grandmother was continually, that's the same line. Gandhiji always felt loud when Kasturba brought him into line, realizing what a powerful way this was to change behavior that was not right. Gandhiji made the decision to adopt this approach with his work, not knowing what name to give to Kasturba's inspiring approach. Gandhiji put the call out for a name to attach to it. That's the origin of Satyagraha. Ela goes on to say that Gandhiji was unhappy when the word could not be properly translated into English. And she says that he was very upset when it was translated as passive resistance, saying that there was nothing passive about this work. However, Gandhiji was unable to find any English word that encompassed the full meaning of Satyagraha. Would any one of you like to comment on that?
Well, I have the pleasure of talking with Ilaji every Friday morning, and as part of our global conversation. And she is, I would never contradict her in terms of her understanding of her grandfather's legacy. And I think it fits with the rest of our conversation today, that we should not think of him as simply the font of knowledge that comes from his mind, but as someone who was searching for truth wherever he might find it, even in his own family, or perhaps especially in his own family.
I mean, I should add there, just add that, it's another example of how important women are to Gandhi's ideas and life. I mentioned in my early remarks his mother's example, of course, his wife's example, which is what Gandhi's narrative foregrounds, but also many others. In his book Satyagraha in South Africa, Gandhi describes, for instance, the resistance of Afrikaner or Boer women in British concentration camps during the Boer War as being a true Satyagraha, and it gives him the idea of elaborating Satyagraha. So it's not even just, here he's talking about women, not even Indian women, not even in India. He learns from everyone, and he learns everywhere, and he is not interested in simply in identifying either his thoughts or his terms or categories in national or racial or ethnic or sexual or gender terms. So I think that's exactly as it should be.
So Dr. Humar, I was just going to, I'm looking at the time, and before we hand over to Rashmi ji to close, the earlier question about the peacekeepers, it was asked in the context of India, and I thought as a closing comment, Dr. Carson, the work of a freedom struggle, whether it's in America or India or elsewhere, is kind of unfinished. It's an unfinished project. And did you have any kind of closing words about, inspiration for the peacekeepers of today in the context of movements, say, in America, such as Black Lives Matter, as one example among others?
Well, I think all of my comments have been meant to encourage those who are taking the struggles into the 21st century. They'll make some mistakes, as we did in the 1960s, and as Gandhi did throughout his life. You make some mistakes. But I think all of us should be engaged in that struggle. If there's any criticism I have of movements, it's not those who were out on the streets and make mistakes. It's those who see their inner transformation as an end in itself. I think that there's a great deal of I guess, mysticism in nonviolent training, as if you could go away for a weekend and learn how to be a nonviolent warrior. I think you can begin that process, but I think that it takes practice. It takes an understanding of engagement with the world. I know that one of the things that I at the same time I'm putting out books that talk about King's ideas, I don't want them to become fossilized. I don't want them to become simply a quote that you can draw out at a particular moment to show that you've read it. I think that one comment that I guess it was Rabbi Heschel made about when he joined the Selma to Montgomery March. He said, "I'm praying with my feet." And I've often thought of that as a way of indicating what ideas that really matter are with your hands and feet and your body. And I think that that's one lesson they have, that they embodied their ideas. And that's what we have to do if we have, if we're going to make those ideas become real.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Nope, thank you. And then Dr. Devji, I was going to say close off with Dr. Carson, unless you have any last words of inspiration or wisdom.
I don't think I can beat those, actually, so I'll remain silent.
Okay, I'm going to hand back now closing remarks from Rashmi ji, please.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Carson, and thank you immensely, Dr. Devji. It was such an enlightening and informative and as well inspiring panel, I would say. There's so many things which you have really brought again to remind us the power of self-analysis and thinking, which is what we often tend to really sidetrack and stop doing, which is what creates all this chaos around us. So it was really, I really want to express my sincere gratitude on behalf of the, Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council to both of you to accept this our invitation and to be here and give this wonderful panel. We hope that it would, if it was normal days, then of course it would have been wonderful to meet with in person and discuss so much more about this thing. Maybe in future, I'm sure that it could really happen. So my sincere thanks to the High Commissioner of India, Mr. Bisaria, and thank you very much, President Benoit, for being here. Both of you really, it makes a lot of difference for us, all of us, which makes by your presence. And I really finally thank everyone who has really been, being here by your presence. This panel is successful, I would say, for all the audience. So thanks again very much. And before we really leave, I would really thank, Dr. Ann for the moderating the event, and Rahil Khan for excellent MC and the moderator, and of course Dr. Humar, who has wonderfully really hosted the whole event and this whole thing. Thanks a lot. And Mr. Anil Agarwal, who is always behind the scene but always there to really help us. And both Dr. Humar and Anil Agarwal, they are the founding members of this of the Peace Council. Dr. Kanta Marwa is here. I would like to quickly introduce, before everybody goes, the board of Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council. So as I said, Dr. Humar and Dr. Kanta Marwa, they are the both Professor Emeritus, and they have been actually since the day one when this organization, they are the ones who are the founding members of the Peace Council. And our current board is Rahil Khan, who's the vice president, Mr. Brij Gupta, he is the treasurer, Selina Deshanti, she is the one who is the secretary, Dr. Ann Vallely, who was our moderator today, and Mayurika Chakravarti, and I think Petula Pinto. I'm not sure whether Petula could really make it today, but it has been beautiful and wonderful to really be working with everybody. So thank you everybody again, and have a great, wonderful day. We look forward to more of this kind of events in future.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. Thank you, Dr. Devji. We
Thank
hope
you very
to
much.
keep in touch as fellow peacemakers and peacekeepers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great work.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
Thanks again. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.